my contribution today and to what we're talking about is it's a discussion of darkness. And their works, I want to share some works that have been very sensitive to transitions to day and night. And in particular, specifically what I've chosen today is to actually work with ones that are pursuing to get, to have more that sort of moment of strangeness of actually having darkness by day. And I've been chasing darkness for quite some time. I'd say that it probably has moved from being something that was much more subconscious to something that became much more conscious and is more of a dedicated part of my research right now. And so I'm still working through trying to talk about it at very different kind of scales and sensitivities. But I've been working primarily in two different ways. It's been photography and installation. And so I'll be showing a little bit of both of those, some of which is happening already. But a couple of things that I want to just say in terms of the interest of maybe talking about it in a venue like this. I want it to be very clear that in the way that I see it, that darkness is not the absence of light. It's actually something that has its own geographies and something that's worth sort of discussing. And a lot of these are actually very spatial conditions. And so these are things in terms of when that condition actually exists, things like geometries are masked, symmetries occur or become obscure, masses are erased, color often recedes or is very altered. Material distinctions are usually muted. Fine detail often falls away. Distances become flattened. There's some silhouetting that occurs. And a lot of times things like depth are thrown into question, so we can really sort of alter those spaces. And as I mentioned, all of these are actually very spatial and material acts. And I think one interesting thing that also comes with it, of course, is that this is something that disappears. It's there and then it goes away. And it's actually something that's incredibly delicate, given the fact that light can immediately disrupt it and take it away. And so it's one thing that actually becomes also important with it and its presence. It's also something that's very kind of attitudinal. It generally means we're either working with something we're trying to imply that's either very calm, very scary, sort of frightening, disruptive. It can be welcoming, it can be warmth. But it certainly has the ability to sort of morph something that we otherwise think is very, very unfamiliar. Everybody okay? So within this, I've created several installations and photographs that I'd like to share, and I'm going to unpack a few of them. Again, these are ones that have to do with actually trying to consider the difference between day and night and literally the sort of condition of darkness by day. And so the first one is called Overnight. This is actually a museum show that really tried to take on itself changing between day and night and a condition that was occurring at the same time as well. And so Overnight was positioned at a time, a very particular time in Detroit when actually we had only 40% of our streetlights. And there was actually this very beautiful darkness that was in the city, but one that was now being replaced and has since now been replaced. And I started a photography series that was literally chasing ahead of the change of our streetlights, trying to capture what was actually starting to disappear, which were these very beautiful sort of dark spaces. And so the work actually started to kind of hunt those out and capture what was happening. As the streetlights were being replaced, what we were starting to lose was actually this ability to see something that is rather already kind of dense or constructed space being extremely not illuminated. Instead, the kind of strangeness of what was there would start to pull out aspects. It would start to draw attention to things that maybe weren't what one would initially think to be the most dominant thing or the most important thing, let's say, to illuminate, but really started to make these wonderful spaces. And so the photography work actually became the basis for choosing how to do an installation that discussed the materials that were at play. When the streetlights were being replaced, what they were copper-lit or copper-wired sodium vapor lamps that were all underground in terms of their wiring. They were being replaced instead with very bright LED lamps, all that had aluminum as their wiring, which despite being much more inefficient than copper was actually less likely to be stolen. So it was also placed above head. And so the installation itself actually picked up on this. And it was made from really thin aluminum strands that were then held from really thin copper lines from above. And the strands actually, intentionally, they were the installation itself was very, very difficult to see by day. You'd enter into an exhibition space that had a corner, as you can see through here, floor-to-ceiling windows on a ground floor, so entirely daylit. And so the entry of actually the installation meant that when you walked in at first, you could barely even see the installation. It was really fine aluminum wound very, very tightly to kind of increase its inefficiency and the kind of comment on the inefficiency of the aluminum that's happening there. And then strikingly, its major change was actually at night. It itself was lit with very high grays lighting and became this ghostly sort of atmosphere that what could not be at all seen by day actually became the brightest thing in that space as the photographs around it sort of fell away with that too. A lot of the photographs keyed into what actually would be the spatial investigation of the installation. So you can see here, you start to see what is just a hint enough of a fragment of that architectural space. And things like glowing or more atmospheric conditions that were what would get the only small amount of illumination. Those would cue into the very kind of bright condition of the formal piece that was instead hung. And so back to the kind of installation that came out of this is the tight winding and then the pulling of it to work with that kind of aggression of removing the wires. They were not all of them. Many of them were also electrified. And so they had tiny little LED lights, just the little tiny nano ones on the bottom of them, so that the project itself too was illuminated at night, but had these kind of moments to see. So this gives you a sense, if you back out now, seeing the sort of ghosting of those pieces, the formal qualities, and your ability to kind of move around it, and by only having those small bits of fragments, to end up getting conditions where if you were not sort of straight on to what would be the recognizable formal condition, instead you're getting much more of something that's atmospheric or more cloud-like with that. And some of this thinking actually came with a project that was a bit earlier than that. This is a project called Unlit that was my contribution to the 2012 Venice Architectural Biennale. This work actually was in an attempt and sort of at request at David Chipperfield, who was the curator for that year, to literally bring a dark volume in Detroit that I had been working with for a previous project. And I went through a lot of tests and considerations about how one actually moves a dark volume. Interestingly enough, it was based on a project that before was really looking at the fact that the city was at that time, with all the boarded up spaces, really a large occupation of very dark volumes. And so this one particular garage I had worked with before, and the first act that I did upon that garage was to block out all these light leaks that you still see. So really to kind of shove material, most of which was wood, as the typical material that's used to board up windows, to really kind of try to block it out. So in its transfer, to take this space and the work I had done previously to Venice, I took basically that moment of the light leak and went for a really, really delicate installation, this also being out of wood, so that it would maintain the same comment. And this really was this kind of tracing of those dark light leaks, and made intentionally out of really thin basswood as the sort of most delicate but stiff structure, and then wood veneers that were cut really delicately. You can see here also that this piece was literally trying to sort of grow towards the window left open for the sake of this work at the Arsenale. And because of it, the humidity over the course of the Biennale slowly wilted, and intentionally and knowingly what happened, slowly wilted the project away. So it would bend and curl in its sort of like delicacy in the understanding of that. So here's the piece this is of course the light from that window striking upon it, and so the precarity of that darkness by day, and seen from above when the light would be in its most harsh situation and actually overlapping with that project. And the last one I want to share, actually, this is sort of the vulnerable moment of the project I'm working on right now, and a few things that are on the works. But I'm currently now moving some of this into an actual building project in Detroit. My Alibi Studio has purchased this set of walls. It literally is a building that exists but no longer has a roof. So we've purchased this, and we have now restored and stabilized these walls, kept all the trees as we could that were around them and inside of it, And it's one of those things it's under that bundle of trees, you can't even see it from Google Earth. It's kind of a great little hideout surprise, but we're building a standalone studio and workshop space within these walls, not to make them load-bearing at all on the original walls, but instead to be its own container within this. And the challenge we've put for ourselves is how can we actually work with something that is roofless and has all this exposure to light, and to see if we can grab some of this darkness by day in the interest of cloaking a sort of glass box space that's in there. This is the thing that we're working with, and this has actually slightly in a way come up in, or maybe as a friend of projects we've seen in the last two presentations, but something we've been working with is a condition known that it's called Mach lines, named after the physicist Ernest Mach. And what it relates to actually is that our eyes have a sort of a reaction when we see the border between two different shades of gray, or gray and white, or gray and nothing. And basically we all see a different darkness because our eyes are actually trying to make up for that difference. So we've become really interested in the idea of building a system that is very sort of filigree and layered. These are just some early studies that are hanging around the windows right now, but it becomes very filigree and layered in its setup, where these now you're seeing are paper and metal studies. We'll be making them out of metal. But basically the interesting thing for us is that all of us will actually see this facade differently. It has to do with your own particular sensitivity to brightness and contrast, as well as where your blind spot is and how your peripheral vision is working. And so for us, we'll get this floating cloud. This happens to be the study for our east elevation, kind of things right in the studio right now to show you as we move into the actual metal pieces that will make that. And yeah, I just wanted to conclude with that in terms of our sort of quest with darkness, and I think a lot of times we end up talking about light, but we're actually trying to aspire to this sort of condition of giving darkness its own space.
When I reflect on this work, I think that it reminds me of something I learned this past month, in which it told me that the ice ages were far more important for the emergence of life than the periods of sun and warmth, in the sense that through profound slowness, things could find multiple degrees of intersection and interrelationship, rather than being polarized into the tars and the precipitates and the shells and the much simpler and disjunctive elements that energy forces things into. And it makes me think that might have a symmetry with what you're offering here. My question is one of language then. Because it's hard not to speak about the extraordinary lucidity and clarity and scintillating qualities of your work, but coming from Apollo, my value system, which is so predicated on the light and the clear and the figural. Right. Could you please offer some terms for the kinds of topologies that emerge, and the qualities that guide you in this?
Sure. Not easily, though. When I started doing some of this work more seriously and trying to write about it, I started to learn all of these different words for darkness, much of which I can't recall at a moment of public speaking. But in terms that I don't think are actually ones that we talk about. I mean, also in response to your question, I found that I actually began doing these installations and these works because I didn't know how to draw the conditions I was interested in or even talk about them. So them themselves as sort of acts, and always immediately starting with a material act, became the way I had to discover that sort of making or lack of light-based language. And I have found that actually instead of the things that I focus most on have a lot to do with the quality of what's happening to the space and how we perceive it, and less being able to have a distinct moment. So it has a lot to do with the fact that there is a sort of perceptual kind of weight to the conditions, and there's also like it's very hard to distinguish what the boundary is, for example, but you know that there's a success when you realize that you've been able to enter it, and you know that there's a clear loss of it. Even when it comes to the moment, let's say, if not even talking about the work, but if we talk about, for instance, we all know that moment of dusk when, sorry, I should say dawn, when the sky is no longer black, but we see blue, we know we've totally lost our darkness. So it is easier to speak of I think it's easier to speak of the lack of darkness, even though we don't want to discuss darkness as sort of a lack of light, because I'd say also the interesting thing is that that light actually needs a substrate, and darkness, however, does not. And so I think that's where we actually have the sort of material and spatial difficulty with it. Yeah, light needs things. Darkness is totally self-reliant. Thank you.